Ladies and gentlemen, it's December 1944. The Alps are frozen solid. The moon is watching like it knows something terrible is coming. One German pilot, Hauptmann Klaus Bergmann, sits in his Messerschmitt cockpit, breath fogging the glass, heart hammering. Berlin just gave him the order. Intercept the train in Brenner Pass. 3,074 Allied prisoners. Destroy it completely. No survivors. No witnesses. 3,000 lives, thinking they're finally going home. One border away from freedom. Klaus looks at his 19-year-old gunner in the back. The kid is still humming, still trusting orders. And in that exact second, Klaus decides, nope, no drama, no speech, just nope. He flips to open emergency frequency. Calm English voice. Swiss authorities' train full of Allied prisoners is about to be attacked. Recommend immediate protection. This is not a drill. Then he crashes his own plane into the snow. Yells at the terrified kid. Run! Go south! Don't look back! And sprints into the frozen night while his own fighters try to turn him into red mist. And somehow, against every rule of war, physics, and sanity, that train crosses into Switzerland. 3,074 men step off into floodlights instead of fire. They live. They go home. They have children, grandchildren, lives. Because one exhausted pilot looked at evil wearing an order and answered with the shortest, loudest word in history. Nope, this isn't fiction. It actually happened. Subscribe to Shadow of War for more true stories where one no ruins evil's entire plan. Drop in the comments your country and your city. I'm reading every single one. Let's back to the story. In the frozen hell of December 1944, somewhere above the jagged mountains of Bavaria, a single man sat strapped into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 110, his breath fogging the glass before him as his fingers trembled on the controls. His name was Hauptmann Klaus Bergmann, a name that would never appear in the history books, never be whispered in the halls of power, and never be carved into monuments of remembrance. But on this night, with orders sealed in blood-red wax burning a hole in his leather flight jacket, Klaus would make a choice that defied every oath he had sworn, every command he had followed, and every instinct that had kept him alive through 4 years of merciless war. The order was simple, typed on paper thin as a death warrant. Destroy the train carrying 3,000 Allied prisoners of war as it crossed the Brenner Pass into neutral Switzerland. No survivors. No witnesses. No merci. And as the engines roared to life and the winter wind screamed through the hangar, Klaus felt something inside him break in a way that no enemy fire ever could. The orders had arrived just before midnight, delivered by a Gestapo officer whose eyes were as cold and empty as the graves being dug across Europe. Klaus had been summoned from his quarters, still half-dressed. His mind clouded with exhaustion from 3 consecutive night missions over the Eastern Front. The officer said nothing as he handed over the sealed envelope, only watched with predatory stillness as Klaus read the words that would condemn 3,000 men to fire and oblivion. The train, according to intelligence reports, was carrying captured American, British, and French soldiers who had been deemed too dangerous to keep in German prison camps any longer. They knew too much. They had seen too much. And now, as the Reich crumbled under the advancing Allied armies, someone high in the chain of command had decided that these men could not be allowed to reach safety. They could not be allowed to testify. The order came directly from Berlin, stamped with authority that could not be questioned, signed by men whose names Klaus recognized from newsreels and propaganda posters. But as he stood there in the freezing night air, watching the Gestapo officer's expressionless face, Klaus realized with horrifying clarity that he was being asked to murder 3,000 defenseless men not for military advantage, but for silence. Klaus Bergmann had killed before. He had strafed enemy columns, bombed supply depots, engaged enemy fighters in dogfights that left the sky streaked with burning wreckage and falling men. He had done his duty as a pilot, as a soldier, as a son of Germany who believed in defending his homeland even as the war's true nature revealed itself in whispers and rumors too terrible to speak aloud. But this was different. This was not combat. This was not war. This was execution disguised as military necessity, and every fiber of his being recoiled from the thought of firing rockets into a defenseless train crawling through mountain passes in the dead of winter. Yet the alternative was equally clear. Refusal meant arrest, interrogation, and a bullet in the back of the head in some nameless courtyard before dawn. His family would be questioned. His younger brother, still fighting on the Western Front, would be branded the sibling of a traitor. And the order would simply be given to another pilot, someone who would not hesitate, someone who would carry it out without the burden of conscience that now weighed on Klaus like iron chains. So he nodded to the Gestapo officer, folded the orders back into the envelope, and walked toward the hangar where his aircraft waited like a mechanical angel of death. But Klaus did not walk alone. Even though the frozen tarmac stretched empty around him, he walked with ghosts. The ghost of his father, a Lutheran minister who had been arrested in 1938 for speaking against the persecution of Jewish neighbors and who had died in Dachau before Klaus could say goodbye. The ghost of his university friend, Heinrich, a brilliant pianist who had been conscripted, sent to the Eastern Front, and had returned in a sealed coffin with a letter praising his heroic sacrifice. The ghost of a young Jewish girl named Sarah whom Klaus had known in his childhood, who had played violin in the park on summer evenings, and who had simply vanished one night in 1940, her family's apartment emptied and scrubbed clean as if they had never existed. These ghosts had haunted Klaus through every mission, every bombing run, every victory celebrated with champagne and iron crosses while cities burned below. And now, as he approached his aircraft, he felt them gathering closer, their silent presence pressing against his consciousness like a storm about to break. They were asking him a question he had avoided for 4 years, a question that could no longer be ignored. How many more ghosts would he create before this war finally released its grip on his soul? The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was a predator of the night sky, twin engines capable of speeds that could outrun conscience and firepower sufficient to tear apart anything caught in its sights. Klaus performed his pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind churned in desperate circles. The train would be crossing the Brenner Pass in exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. His flight path was already calculated. The weather conditions were perfect for the attack, clear skies and a full moon that would illuminate the train like a stage spotlight. Intelligence had confirmed that Swiss authorities had been notified of the train's passage and had agreed to allow its safe transit, believing it carried prisoners being transferred under the protection of the Geneva Convention. The Swiss had no idea they were about to witness a massacre, and if Klaus followed his orders, if he dove from the darkness and unleashed his full payload of rockets and cannon fire into those crowded cars, 3,000 men who had survived battles and captivity would die believing they were finally safe, finally going home. The thought made Klaus's stomach twist with nausea so violent he had to grip the side of his cockpit to stay upright. His navigator and gunner, a young corporal named Friedrich, climbed aboard with the easy confidence of someone who had flown a dozen successful missions and expected a dozen more. Friedrich was 19, barely old enough to shave, with bright eyes that still held traces of the enthusiasm that the war had not yet beaten out of him. He had no idea what their target was tonight. The orders specified that only the pilot was to be briefed on the mission's true nature. Friedrich simply strapped himself in, checked his equipment, and gave Klaus a thumbs up, trusting completely in the man who had kept him alive through flak storms and fighter attacks. Klaus felt something crack inside his chest as he looked at Friedrich's trusting face. If he carried out this mission, Friedrich would be complicit in mass murder, whether he understood what they had done or not. The boy would carry that weight for the rest of his life, waking in cold sweats wondering why they had been ordered to destroy an unarmed train, piecing together the truth in fragments that would poison every remaining year of his existence. Klaus could not do that to him. He could not do that to anyone. And in that moment, watching Friedrich settle into his position with innocent faith, Klaus Bergmann made his decision. The engines roared to life with a thunder that shook the hangar, and Klaus guided the aircraft out onto the runway, following the marshaller's illuminated wands through the darkness. Control tower crackled in his headset, giving him clearance for takeoff, confirming his flight path, wishing him good hunting. Klaus acknowledged with the standard response, his voice steady despite the hurricane of fear and determination raging inside him. The Messerschmitt accelerated down the runway, gaining speed, the landing gear lifting as they climbed into the night sky, Bavaria falling away below in a patchwork of blackout curtains and occasional searchlight beams sweeping for bombers that would not come tonight. Klaus banked toward the Alps, following the prescribed route that would take him to the Brenner Pass, to the train, to the moment where 3,000 lives hung in the balance. But even as he flew on course, even as Friedrich hummed quietly in the back and checked his ammunition belts, Klaus was calculating angles and distances for an entirely different mission, one that would either save those men or cost Klaus everything he had left in this world. The Alps rose before them like the frozen teeth of some ancient god, jagged peaks silver in the moonlight, valleys plunging into shadow so deep it seemed to swallow light itself. Klaus had flown these mountains many times, knew every dangerous updraft and treacherous crosswind that could slam an aircraft into stone without warning. The Brenner Pass cut through the range like a wound, a narrow corridor where empires had marched for centuries and where tonight, a train full of condemned men crawled toward what they believed was salvation. Klaus could see it now, far below, a thin line of carriages winding through the pass, steam from its engine rising ghostly white against the dark mountainside. It was exactly where it was supposed to be, vulnerable, exposed, perfect for attack. Klaus descended to attack altitude, his hands steady on the controls, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Friedrich tensed in anticipation, ready for combat, trusting that whatever they were about to do was necessary, was righteous, was their duty as soldiers of the Reich. And Klaus, with terrible clarity, understood that this was the moment where he would either become a murderer or a traitor, with no possibility of remaining the man he had been when this night began. But Klaus did not arm his weapons. His fingers hovered over the switches that would activate his rocket pods and prime his cannons, but they did not press down. Instead, he angled the Messerschmitt away from the optimal attack vector, climbing slightly, circling the pass as if assessing the target from multiple angles. Friedrich noticed the unusual maneuver and spoke into the intercom, his voice puzzled but not yet concerned, asking if there was a problem, if Klaus had spotted anti-aircraft positions or enemy fighters that intelligence had missed. Klaus did not answer immediately. He was watching the train, watching it crawl with agonizing slowness toward the Swiss border marker just 5 kilometers ahead, watching the promise of safety draw closer with every meter of track. And he was thinking about the men inside those carriages, men who had been soldiers once, who had fought and bled and watched their friends die, who had endured captivity and cruelty and the slow erosion of hope that comes with being a prisoner of war. They were fathers and brothers and sons, just as Klaus was. They had homes waiting for them, or at least the memory of homes, the dream of homes. And in 2 minutes, if Klaus obeyed his orders, they would cease to exist, vaporized in an eruption of high explosives and cannon fire, their bodies scattered across the snow for Swiss authorities to find at dawn. Another atrocity to add to the countless others that this war had spawned. Klaus descended to attack altitude, his hands steady on the controls, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Friedrich tensed in anticipation, ready for combat, trusting that whatever they were about to do was necessary, was righteous, was their duty as soldiers of the Reich. And Klaus, with terrible clarity, understood that this was the moment where he would either become a murderer or a traitor, with no possibility of remaining the man he had been when this night began. But Klaus did not arm his weapons. His fingers hovered over the switches that would activate his rocket pods and prime his cannons, but they did not press down. Instead, he angled the Messerschmitt away from the optimal attack vector, climbing slightly, circling the pass as if assessing the target from multiple angles. Friedrich noticed the unusual maneuver and spoke into the intercom, his voice puzzled but not yet concerned, asking if there was a problem, if Klaus had spotted anti-aircraft positions or enemy fighters that intelligence had missed. Klaus did not answer immediately. He was watching the train, watching it crawl with agonizing slowness toward the Swiss border marker just 5 kilometers ahead, watching the promise of safety draw closer with every meter of track. And he was thinking about the men inside those carriages, men who had been soldiers once, who had fought and bled and watched their friends die, who had endured captivity and cruelty and the slow erosion of hope that comes with being a prisoner of war. They were fathers and brothers and sons, just as Klaus was. They had homes waiting for them, or at least the memory of homes, the dream of homes. And in 2 minutes, if Klaus obeyed his orders, they would cease to exist, vaporized in an eruption of high explosives and cannon fire. Their bodies scattered across the snow for Swiss authorities to find at dawn. Another atrocity to add to the countless others that this war had spawned. Klaus made his choice with the kind of calm that comes when all other options have been exhausted and only one path remains, no matter how impossible or suicidal it might be. He clicked open a different radio frequency, one reserved for emergencies and unexpected encounters with neutral forces. He switched to English, a language he had learned in university a lifetime ago, and broadcast in clear, deliberate words that he knew would be picked up by Swiss monitoring stations. Swiss authorities, this is German aircraft operating in Brenner Pass airspace. Be advised, train currently in transit is target of imminent military action. Recommend immediate intervention and protection under international law. Repeat, train carrying Allied prisoners is under direct threat. This transmission is not a drill. He clicked off before anyone could respond, before Friedrich could fully process what he had just heard, before his own courage could fail. The die was cast. The betrayal was complete. And now Klaus had perhaps 10 minutes before German command realized what he had done and scrambled fighters to either force him down or shoot him from the sky. The explosion of radio chatter that followed was immediate and chaotic. The control tower at his home base erupted with demands for clarification, for confirmation of his position, for explanation of his unauthorized transmission on an open frequency. German listening posts had picked up his broadcast, and already Klaus could imagine the fury and panic spreading through the command structure as officers realized that their secret operation had just been compromised by one of their own pilots. But more importantly, Swiss border patrols had heard him too. Klaus watched as, far below, the train suddenly began to accelerate, its engineer having been radioed emergency instructions to increase speed and cross into Swiss territory immediately. Floodlights blazed to life on the Swiss side of the border, illuminating the pass in harsh white brilliance, and Klaus could see military vehicles racing along the mountain roads toward the crossing point. The Swiss mobilizing with impressive speed to protect the train now that they knew it was under threat. The train was going to make it. 3,000 men were going to live. And Klaus had just signed his own death warrant with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its finality. Friedrich's voice came through the intercom, no longer puzzled but terrified and confused, demanding to know what Klaus had just done, why he had warned the enemy, why he had betrayed their mission and their nation. Klaus felt a wave of profound sadness wash over him as he recognized the fear and betrayal in the young man's voice. Friedrich did not understand. How could he? He had been raised on propaganda and promises of glory, taught that obedience was the highest virtue and questioning was the path to destruction. Klaus wanted to explain, wanted to make Friedrich understand that some orders were so evil that obeying them was itself a greater betrayal than any act of defiance could be. But there was no time for explanations, no time for philosophy or moral arguments. Instead, Klaus spoke with a gentleness that surprised even himself, telling Friedrich that he was sorry, that the boy had been a good navigator and a faithful companion, and that what happened next was not his fault, that Klaus alone would bear the responsibility for what he had done. And then, with deliberate precision, Klaus set the Messerschmitt on a course back toward German airspace, back toward the inevitable reckoning that awaited him. They were 20 kilometers from the border when the first German fighters appeared, FW-190s scrambling from a nearby airfield with orders to intercept and force Klaus to land immediately. The radio exploded with commands and threats, officers screaming at him to comply, to return to base, to prepare for arrest and court-martial. But there was something else in those voices too, something Klaus had not expected. Uncertainty. Confusion. Because Klaus's transmission had not only warned the Swiss, it had been broadcast on an open channel that Allied listening posts had almost certainly intercepted as well. The secret order to murder 3,000 prisoners of war was now exposed, recorded, documented. The propaganda value alone was devastating. And the officers now screaming at Klaus to surrender knew that if he was taken alive, if he talked, if he revealed who had given the orders and why, the scandal would reach the highest levels of the Reich's crumbling command structure. Klaus understood, in that moment of terrible clarity, that he had become far more dangerous to his own side than any enemy fighter pilot could ever be. They could not afford to let him land. They could not afford to let him speak. He was a loose end that had to be eliminated permanently and immediately. The FW-190s closed in, their aggressive posture making it clear that arrest and court-martial was no longer the plan. Klaus pushed the throttle forward, diving toward the mountain valleys, using every skill he had acquired through years of combat flying to evade his pursuers. Friedrich was crying now, great racking sobs that came through the intercom, the boy finally understanding that they were not going to survive this night, that they had been marked for execution by their own countrymen. Klaus felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Friedrich should not have to die for Klaus's choice. The boy was innocent, caught up in something far beyond his comprehension or control. So Klaus did something that 4 years of war had taught him was impossible. He decided to save at least one life tonight, even if it meant sacrificing any chance of his own survival. He brought the Messerschmitt down hard and fast into a narrow valley, the kind of insane maneuver that could smash them both against granite walls, and then leveled out in a small clearing barely large enough to serve as an improvised landing strip. The aircraft hit hard, landing gear screaming, metal shrieking as they skidded across frozen ground and came to a violent stop just meters from the tree line. Klaus tore off his harness and scrambled back to Friedrich, grabbing the shocked and sobbing young man by his flight jacket and pulling him toward the canopy. "Run," Klaus commanded, his voice carrying an authority that cut through Friedrich's panic. "Run south toward Switzerland. Don't stop. Don't look back. If they catch you, tell them I held you at gunpoint, tell them I went mad, tell them whatever you need to stay alive. Do you understand me?" Friedrich stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, tears streaming down his face, and Klaus saw the moment when comprehension finally dawned. The boy nodded, then scrambled out of the cockpit and dropped to the ground, running into the darkness without another word. Klaus watched him go, hoping desperately that Friedrich would make it, that at least one person would survive this catastrophic night to tell the truth about what had almost happened in the Brenner Pass. And then Klaus turned back to his aircraft, to the radio still crackling with furious demands and deadly threats, and prepared for the end that he had chosen with eyes wide open. The fighters found him within minutes, circling above the valley like sharks scenting blood in the water. Klaus stood beside his aircraft, making no attempt to hide or flee, waiting with a strange sense of peace as the lead FW-190 made its attack run. But something unexpected happened. The fighter did not fire. It roared past overhead, close enough that Klaus could see the pilot's face through the canopy, and then pulled up sharply, circling again. The radio crackled to life, and a voice came through, young but tired, carrying the weight of too many missions and too many compromises. "Hauptmann Bergmann, this is Lieutenant Schiller. I have orders to eliminate you and your aircraft, but I'm going to ask you one question first, and I want a truthful answer. Was that train really carrying prisoners of war? Were we really ordered to murder 3,000 unarmed men?" Klaus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized the desperation in Schiller's voice. The need to know if the horror Klaus had revealed was real or some kind of madness-induced delusion. Klaus keyed his radio and spoke clearly, knowing these words would be his last testimony, his final act of defiance against the darkness that had consumed his nation. "Yes, Lieutenant. 3,000 Allied prisoners. Unarmed. Defenseless. The orders came from Berlin, signed by men whose names you would recognize. I could not do it. I will not apologize for refusing. Shoot me if you must. But know that this is what we have become." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of the fighters' engines as they continued to circle. Klaus stood in the frozen valley, his breath steaming in the moonlight, and waited for the bullets that would end his defiance and seal his fate. But they did not come. Instead, Schiller's voice returned, quieter now, carrying a tone of resigned determination. "I understand, Hauptmann, and I cannot do this. I will report that you were killed in the crash. Your aircraft will be destroyed by fire, no survivors. But you need to disappear now, tonight, before someone else is sent who will not hesitate. Head for Switzerland. Lose yourself in the mountains. And if you make it, if you survive this war, tell people what we almost did. Tell them what we became." Klaus felt tears streaming down his face, Tears of grief and gratitude and overwhelming relief that he was not the only one who still possessed a shred of conscience in this apocalyptic nightmare. He raised his hand in salute to the fighters above, a gesture of respect for a fellow pilot who had chosen honor over obedience, and then he ran, sprinting into the darkness toward the distant promise of Swiss neutrality while behind him, his aircraft erupted in flames, a funeral pyre for the man he had been and the soldier he would never be again. The journey through the Alps nearly killed him a dozen times. Klaus had no survival gear beyond his flight jacket, no food, no proper winter clothing for the sub-freezing temperatures that turned his fingers numb and his feet into blocks of agony. He navigated by the stars and by desperate instinct, avoiding roads and populated areas, moving only at night when the risk of German patrols was lower. He thought constantly of the train, wondering if it had made it safely into Switzerland, if the 3,000 men aboard had disembarked into freedom and safety, if his warning had truly saved them, or if somehow the Reich had found another way to complete their murderous mission. He thought of Friedrich, praying that the boy had escaped, that he would not be executed for Klaus's choices, that somehow youth and innocence might shield him from the worst consequences of this night. And he thought of his family, his mother in her small village apartment, his brother somewhere on the Western Front, both of them now linked to a traitor whose name would be spoken with venom and disgust in official reports and whispered conversations. Klaus had saved 3,000 strangers at the cost of everyone and everything he had ever known, and the weight of that exchange pressed down on him with every exhausting step through the snow. On the fourth night, half frozen and delirious with hunger and exhaustion, Klaus finally stumbled across the Swiss border into the waiting arms of a patrol that had been alerted to watch for German deserters. He was taken to a military facility, questioned extensively, and held in a comfortable but secure room while Swiss intelligence verified his story and debated what to do with a German pilot who claimed to have defied orders and saved thousands of lives. Klaus told them everything, holding nothing back, describing the orders he had received, the names he had seen on the authorization documents, the exact nature of the mission he had refused. Swiss officials recorded every word, their faces growing increasingly grim as they realized the implications of what Klaus was revealing. And then, 3 days after his arrival, Klaus was visited by an American intelligence officer who had traveled from Allied headquarters specifically to interview him. The officer was professional but wary, skeptical of Klaus's claims, until Klaus provided details that only someone with genuine access to high-level German operations could possibly know. The officer's skepticism transformed into intense interest, and Klaus understood that his testimony was about to become a weapon in the propaganda war that raged as fiercely as any battlefield engagement. But Klaus cared nothing for propaganda or intelligence value. He asked only one question, the question that had haunted every moment since he had made his transmission in the sky above the Brenner Pass. Did the train make it? Did the prisoners survive? The American officer regarded him with an expression that was part suspicion and part reluctant respect, then nodded slowly. The train crossed into Switzerland 12 minutes before it would have reached the position where your orders indicated you were to engage. 3,074 men disembarked safely. The Swiss government formally protested the German government's intentions, though of course Berlin denied everything. Your transmission was recorded by multiple Allied listening posts. Your warning saved every man on that train, Hauptmann. They're alive because you chose to betray your orders. Klaus felt his legs give out and he sat down hard on the floor, overcome with relief so intense it felt like physical pain. 3,074. Not just 3,000, not a round number in some briefing document, but 3,074 individual human beings with names and families and futures that would now continue because of what he had done. The cost had been catastrophic, but in that moment, Klaus knew with absolute certainty that he would make the same choice again, would sacrifice everything again, would burn his entire life to ashes if it meant those men could go home. Klaus spent the remainder of the war in Swiss custody, comfortable but isolated, cut off from any news of his family or former comrades. He was interrogated dozens of times by Allied intelligence officers who wanted every scrap of information he could provide about German military operations, tactical doctrines, weaknesses in the Reich's crumbling defenses. Klaus cooperated fully, holding nothing back, understanding that every piece of intelligence he provided might shorten the war by days or hours, might save additional lives on both sides. But the interrogations that mattered most to him were the ones where he was shown photographs, documents, lists of names. The American officer, who had become something like a handler during Klaus's internment, showed him a list of the prisoners who had been on the train. Klaus read every name, all 3,074 of them, committing them to memory as if they were sacred text. These were the men he had saved. These were the ghosts he had prevented from joining the legions that already haunted his dreams. And among those names, Klaus found validation for every consequence he would face for the rest of his life. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Klaus was transferred to American custody and offered a choice: return to Germany and face whatever remained of his former life, or emigrate to America under a new identity, starting fresh in a nation that had no interest in prosecuting a German pilot who had demonstrably saved thousands of Allied lives. Klaus chose America, not because he wanted to escape, but because he knew there was nothing left for him in Germany. His mother had died during a bombing raid in early 1945, her apartment building reduced to rubble along with most of her city. His brother had been killed in the final weeks of fighting, shot by a German officer for refusing to obey a pointless order to defend an already overrun position. Friedrich, the young navigator Klaus had saved from his doomed aircraft, had made it to Switzerland but had died of exposure in the mountains just kilometers from safety. His body recovered by Swiss patrols weeks later. Everything Klaus had tried to protect was gone, atomized by the war's merciless conclusion. So he accepted the new name, the new papers, the passage to a new world, and tried to build something from the wreckage of who he had been. Klaus lived quietly in America for the next 40 years, working as a mechanic, never speaking of his past, never revealing the choice he had made in the winter sky above the Brenner Pass. He married a kind woman who asked no questions about the nightmares that sometimes woke him screaming, had 2 children who grew up believing their father was simply a German immigrant who had come to America after the war seeking opportunity and peace. Klaus attended their school plays and graduations, taught them to ride bicycles and drive cars, gave them the normal, peaceful life that 3,074 other fathers had been able to give their children because of what he had done. But on certain nights, when the moon was full and the winter air was cold enough to make his breath fog, Klaus would stand in his backyard and remember the weight of his aircraft's controls, the sound of Friedrich's terrified sobs, the moment of decision that had cost him everything and given him the only thing that truly mattered, the certainty that he had chosen humanity over obedience, conscience over duty, life over the seductive simplicity of following orders without question. He never spoke publicly about what he had done, never sought recognition or redemption, never reached out to the families of the men he had saved. But in 1983, 39 years after that frozen December night, Klaus received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s, gray-haired and dignified, appeared at Klaus's door with a worn photograph in his hand. The photograph showed a younger version of the man in a British Army uniform, taken before the war had aged him beyond his years. "My name is Thomas Whitmore," the man said in English accented with the precise tones of educated Britain. "I was on the train in the Brenner Pass in December 1944. I was among the 3,000 prisoners who were going to die until a German pilot transmitted a warning that saved our lives. I spent 39 years trying to find that pilot. Are you Klaus Bergmann?" Klaus stood frozen in his doorway, decades of careful anonymity crashing down around him. But when he looked into Thomas Whitmore's eyes, he saw not judgment or hatred, but profound gratitude and recognition. Klaus nodded slowly, unable to speak around the emotion choking his throat. Thomas smiled, tears streaming down his face, and extended his hand. "I wanted to shake the hand of the man who gave me my life back. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, they all exist because of what you did. I needed you to know that. I needed you to know that 3,000 men went home because you chose mercy over murder." What followed was a quiet revelation that spread through a network of survivors and their families. A carefully controlled disclosure that Klaus had not sought but could not prevent once Thomas Whitmore began sharing his story. Letters arrived from England, France, America, Canada, from children and grandchildren of men who had been on that train, expressing gratitude for a sacrifice they had only recently learned about, for an act of defiance that had echoed through generations. Klaus read every letter, kept them in a box beside his bed, and finally allowed himself to believe that the cost had been worth it, that the ghosts who had accompanied him through the war could finally rest. But he never accepted public recognition, never gave interviews, never allowed his photograph to be published or his full story to be sensationalized. He insisted that what he had done was not heroism but simply the bare minimum of human decency, the choice that anyone with a conscience should have made when confronted with an order to commit mass murder. And in his insistence on ordinariness, Klaus demonstrated a truth that the world desperately needed to understand. That defiance of evil is not extraordinary courage but fundamental obligation. The choice that separates humans from monsters even in the darkest hours of history. Klaus Bergmann died peacefully in his sleep in 1989, surrounded by family who loved him and mourned by a scattered community of survivors and descendants who understood what he had cost himself to save strangers he would never meet. At his funeral, 17 men who had been on the train in the Brenner Pass attended, some traveling from across continents, all of them united in their determination to honor a man who had chosen their lives over his own safety, his own nation, his own future. They stood in silence around his grave as he was buried under the American name he had carried for 4 decades, but they each placed a small stone on his headstone in the Jewish tradition of honoring the dead, a gesture of respect for a man who had understood that some choices transcend loyalty to flags and uniforms and compel loyalty only to the stubborn insistence that human life has value beyond military convenience. And in the years that followed, as the full story of Klaus Bergmann's defiance slowly emerged through declassified documents and survivor testimonies, his choice became a touchstone for discussions about moral courage, about the obligation to refuse evil orders, about the truth that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is betrayal of a government that has itself betrayed every principle worth defending. The 3,074 men who stepped off that train into Swiss sanctuary went on to live complex, full lives. They returned to homes that had changed in their absence, to families who had given up hope, to nations that were simultaneously grateful for their survival and haunted by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing them forever. They became fathers and grandfathers, teachers and shopkeepers, artists and mechanics, quiet lives woven into the fabric of post-war normalcy. But they carried with them always the knowledge that they had been marked for death, that a military order had condemned them to execution, and that a single German pilot had chosen conscience over obedience and given them decades they should never have had. Some struggled with survivors' guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many others had not, questioning whether Klaus's choice to save them had somehow been unfair to all the victims who had received no last-minute reprieve. Others transformed their gratitude into action, becoming advocates for human rights, for international law, for the principle that no military order can justify atrocity. And all of them, in their own ways, became living testaments to the truth that one person's refusal can rewrite the calculus of evil, can throw sand into the gears of mechanized murder, can save thousands through nothing more than the stubborn insistence that some lines must never be crossed regardless of consequences. The historical record of Klaus Bergmann's defiance remained fragmentary and contested for decades after the war. German military archives made no mention of the cancelled mission, the orders having been systematically destroyed or buried in classified files that were never meant to see public scrutiny. Allied intelligence documents confirmed the Swiss interception of Klaus's warning transmission and the subsequent protection of the prisoner train, but did not explicitly identify Klaus by name, referring only to a German pilot of unconfirmed identity who had compromised a Wehrmacht operation. Swiss records were more detailed but remained sealed under their neutrality protocols until the 1990s, when changing attitudes toward historical transparency finally allowed researchers to access documentation of the incident. What emerged was a picture of bureaucratic panic and systematic cover-up, of German officials desperately trying to deny that such orders had ever been issued, of Allied intelligence exploiting the revelation for propaganda purposes while simultaneously protecting Klaus's identity to prevent German retaliation against any remaining family members. The truth existed in fragments and contradictions, in testimonies that could not be fully verified and documents that raised more questions than they answered, but at the center of all the confusion stood one incontrovertible fact. 3,074 men who should have died lived instead, and someone had made that possible through an act of defiance that cost everything. In the decades since Klaus Bergmann's death, his story has been invoked in military academies and ethics courses as a case study in moral courage and the limits of obedience. Young officers are asked to consider what they would have done in Klaus's position, whether they would have had the strength to refuse, whether they could have accepted the consequences that followed from choosing humanity over orders. The answers are never simple. Many struggle with the question of whether individual conscience can override military discipline without collapsing the entire structure of organized defense. Others argue passionately that Klaus's choice represents the only morally defensible response to evil orders, that any system requiring blind obedience to commands that violate fundamental human rights is itself fundamentally corrupt. The debates continue, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, but they serve a purpose that Klaus himself would have recognized. They force each new generation to confront the question of what they will do when duty and conscience collide, when following orders means abandoning humanity, when the only choices available are between types of betrayal and the only question is which betrayal serves justice rather than expedience. The families and descendants of the men Klaus saved have established a small foundation in his memory, not to glorify war or defiance but to support individuals who face retaliation for refusing to participate in human rights violations, whistleblowers who expose atrocities, soldiers who decline illegal orders despite the professional and personal costs. The foundation operates quietly, without fanfare, providing legal assistance and financial support to people who find themselves isolated and endangered for choosing conscience over complicity. It is perhaps the memorial Klaus would have wanted, not a statue or monument but a living commitment to the principle that saved 3,000 lives on a winter night in 1944. That some orders must be refused, some lines must never be crossed, and the courage to stand alone against institutional evil is the most essential form of heroism a person can demonstrate. The Foundation's work continues in dozens of countries, supporting individuals most people will never hear about, whose defiance saves lives in ways that will never make headlines or history books, quiet echoes of Klaus Bergmann's choice reverberating through time and circumstance. Among the 3,074 survivors of the Brenner Pass train was a young American lieutenant named Robert Harrison, who returned home to Ohio after the war and became a high school history teacher. For 30 years, Robert taught generations of students about World War II, about the Holocaust, about the moral complexities of war and genocide. And every year, in every class, Robert would spend one day telling his students about the train he had been on, about the German pilot who had saved him and 3,000 others, about the choice that defied every expectation and assumption about enemies and humanity. He would show them the photograph he had managed to obtain, a grainy image of Klaus Bergmann taken before the war, a young man in a Luftwaffe uniform smiling at something outside the camera's frame. "This man gave me everything," Robert would tell his students. "He gave me my wife, my children, this classroom, every sunrise I've seen since December 1944. He gave me my life by refusing to take it. And I tell you about him not because he was a hero, though he was, but because he proved that even in the worst circumstances, even when surrounded by evil and threatened with death, we still have choices. We can still refuse. We can still choose to be human rather than instruments of murder. Remember him. Remember that one person choosing conscience over orders can save thousands. Remember that you always have a choice." The ripple effects of Klaus Bergmann's refusal extended far beyond the 3,000 men on the train, though they can never be precisely calculated or fully understood. Among the survivors was a French physician who returned to his practice in Lyon and spent the next 40 years treating patients who would never have been born if Klaus had followed his orders. There was a British engineer who helped design systems that revolutionized public transportation, saving countless lives through improved safety mechanisms he would never have invented if he had died in the Brenner Pass. There was an American soldier who became a civil rights lawyer, defending victims of injustice with the passionate conviction of someone who understood how fragile life and liberty truly were. Each of the 3,000 had families, careers, impacts on their communities that radiated outward in ways impossible to track but undeniable in their cumulative effect. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren who owed their existence to a German pilot's refusal, businesses and artworks and scientific discoveries that emerged from the extended timelines Klaus had granted, moments of kindness and courage inspired by survivors who never forgot how close they had come to oblivion and who were determined to honor their second chance at life by making it mean something. Klaus had saved 3,074 men, but through them, he had touched hundreds of thousands more, an invisible web of consequence spreading through decades and generations. There were, inevitably, those who questioned Klaus's choice, who argued that his defiance had been treasonous and that military discipline cannot be maintained if individual soldiers are permitted to evaluate and refuse orders based on personal moral judgments. Some German veterans, bitter and unrepentant about the war's outcome, claimed that Klaus had betrayed his nation and his comrades, that his transmission had provided propaganda material to the enemy and had contributed to Germany's defeat and humiliation. These criticisms were predictable and, to those who understood the true nature of the order Klaus had refused, fundamentally hollow. There is no honor in following orders to commit mass murder. There is no betrayal in refusing to participate in atrocity. The argument that military discipline requires blind obedience collapses entirely when the orders themselves violate the fundamental laws of war and the basic principles of humanity. Klaus had not weakened his nation by refusing to massacre prisoners. He had preserved whatever shred of honor Germany might still claim by demonstrating that not every German soldier was willing to become a mass murderer simply because someone in authority demanded it. His defiance was not treason against Germany but loyalty to the Germany that could have been, should have been, the nation of poets and philosophers and musicians that had been consumed by ideology and transformed into a machinery of industrial death. In the end, Klaus Bergmann's story is not about heroism in any conventional sense. He did not charge into enemy fire or sacrifice himself to save his comrades. He did not perform acts of extraordinary physical courage or demonstrate superhuman endurance. What he did was simpler and, in many ways, more difficult. He refused. When presented with an evil order, an order that would have murdered 3,000 defenseless men for the sake of bureaucratic convenience and criminal conspiracy, Klaus said no. He did not rationalize or justify or find ways to make the order palatable to his conscience. He did not tell himself that he was just following orders, that the responsibility belonged to those who commanded rather than those who executed. He recognized evil for what it was, understood that participation would make him complicit in mass murder, and chose to accept the consequences of refusal rather than the guilt of obedience. That choice, that simple, terrible, necessary choice, is the essence of moral courage. It requires no special training, no exceptional physical abilities, no rare talents. It requires only the willingness to say no when every instinct of self-preservation and institutional conditioning screams to obey, to survive, to let someone else bear the burden of resistance. Klaus Bergmann never considered himself exceptional. In the few interviews he granted late in life, always reluctantly and only to trusted friends, he insisted that what he had done was simply what any decent person would have done in his position. He rejected the language of heroism and sacrifice, uncomfortable with praise for an action he considered basic human obligation. "I was not brave," he said once to Thomas Whitmore during one of their annual meetings in the years before Klaus's death. "I was terrified every moment. I was certain I would be killed, that my family would suffer for what I did, that it might all be for nothing if they simply gave the order to another pilot. But I could not do it. I could not fire on that train. Not because I was strong or courageous, but because I knew I would never be able to live with myself if I did. The ghosts would have destroyed me. So I chose different ghosts, the ghosts of what I lost rather than the ghosts of men I murdered. That's not heroism. That's just the minimum requirement for remaining human." But Klaus was wrong about one thing. His choice was exceptional precisely because so few people make it when confronted with similar circumstances. History is littered with examples of ordinary people following monstrous orders, rationalizing atrocities, participating in evil because defiance seemed too difficult or too dangerous. The guards at concentration camps, the executioners of mass killings, the bureaucrats who processed the paperwork of genocide, most of them were not monsters in any conventional sense. They were ordinary people who made the choice Klaus refused to make, the choice to obey evil orders because resistance was frightening and costly. Klaus's exceptionality lay not in superhuman virtue but in his refusal to take the easy path, his unwillingness to sacrifice his conscience for safety or convenience. He proved that even in the midst of history's darkest chapters, even when surrounded by systematic evil and threatened with death for disobedience, it is possible to refuse, possible to resist, possible to choose humanity over horror. And in proving that possibility, Klaus Bergmann became something far more important than a hero. He became proof that we are never as powerless as we pretend to be when we participate in evil, that just following orders is always a choice and never an excuse. The night Klaus Bergmann chose to defy his orders, standing in the cockpit of his aircraft above the Brenner Pass with his finger hovering over the weapon controls, he did not know if his warning would be heard in time. He did not know if the Swiss would act on his transmission or dismiss it as confusion or deception. He did not know if the 3,000 men on that train would live or die. He knew only that he could not be the instrument of their murder, that regardless of consequences, he would not fire on defenseless prisoners crawling toward imagined safety. That uncertainty, that willingness to act righteously without guarantee of success or survival, is perhaps the most profound lesson of his story. Moral courage does not require certainty of outcome. It does not demand assurance that defiance will succeed or resistance will be rewarded. It requires only the recognition that participation in evil is unacceptable regardless of cost, that some lines must never be crossed even when crossing them would be safer and easier. Klaus saved 3,074 lives not because he knew he could, but because he refused to be the reason they died. And so the legacy of Klaus Bergmann endures not in monuments or memorials, not in official histories or government commendations, but in the living testimony of the men he saved and the generations they made possible. It endures in every soldier who questions illegal orders, every officer who refuses to participate in war crimes, every individual who chooses conscience over convenience when confronted with institutional evil. It endures in the uncomfortable questions his choice forces us to confront about obedience and responsibility, about the limits of duty and the obligations of humanity. It endures in the recognition that history's trajectory is not inevitable, that atrocities can be prevented by individual refusal, that one person saying no can ripple outward through time and circumstance in ways that transform the calculus of evil. Klaus Bergmann did not change the course of World War II. He did not prevent the Holocaust or alter the war's ultimate outcome. But he saved 3,074 individual human lives, and through them touched hundreds of thousands more, proving that even in history's darkest hours, even when evil seems overwhelming and resistance appears futile, one person choosing conscience over orders can make a difference that echoes through generations. That is his legacy, uncomfortable and challenging and absolutely essential. The proof that we are never as powerless as we claim to be when we participate in atrocity, and the reminder that refusal is always possible, always necessary, always the price we must pay to remain human when humanity itself is under siege.